Right, thank you for having me today. My name is Weifeng Zhong with the Mercator Center at George Mason University. My day job at the Mercator Center is to do research for fun. So I do my job really well, by the way. And then hoping that sometimes what's fun in my research is also useful. So I'm hoping to introduce to you a project that I have done, an ongoing project for the last few years that turned out to be useful in guiding us through thinking about policy issues. So I'm going to talk about how NLP can be used in conducting propaganda analysis. And more specifically, I'm hoping to convince you toward the end of my presentation that we can actually learn a lot from fake news, okay? But before I tell you about my research project, let me start with where I was born and raised, which is China. Now, China is easily one of the subjects in many conversations these days, for good reason, because it is a very, so to speak, question-rich environment, meaning that there are a lot of important policy issues that are affecting our lives, and they have to do with China. Most obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Now, for example, there are a lot of questions related to China on the subject of COVID, for example. The official numbers published by the Chinese Communist Party regarding how many cases there has been in China, it's very questionable. Now, many people doubt the accuracy of those numbers, but how inaccurate those numbers are is a quantitative question, much harder to answer. Right? Now that the pandemic has largely subsided in China, what's next in China's agenda? Right? So that will affect that will also have huge impact on the rest of the world. And remember those protests, the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong last year and also earlier this year? Well, an important question back then was whether those protesters would face a violent military crackdown by the Chinese military, right? So all these questions are super important, very hard to answer. And I will try to submit to you a proposition that many of these questions can be answered by the real fake news, which is the propaganda messages coming out from the Chinese government. Now, the picture you see is some of those newspapers in China. And a note on those pictures is that they are published on the same date. And as you can see, although they are different newspapers, they sort of try to deliver the uniform message. For example, this is when President Xi Jinping took power. And as you can see, many newspapers in China, they publish the same headshot of the Chinese president without much diversity. So the point is that national media in China are very disciplined. And we can hopefully learn a lot from those unified messages coming out from the Chinese media. And this is what basically drives the programs under the umbrella that we call the Policy Chang Index project. We started this project a few years ago, and it only does one thing, which is to use natural language processing to analyze propaganda coming out from authoritarian regimes. And then we try to make policy predictions based just on these propaganda messages and nothing else. Okay. Now, the first use cases we have done so far are on China on various issues. And those would also include the questions that I raised just a minute ago. And in the future, we are also looking to include other authoritarian regimes in the index, such as North Korea, Cuba, Iran, what have you. And all the projects we have conducted under the Policy Chang Index are open source and free, so you can find the source code on GitHub. Before I explain all these findings we have under this project, let me first say a few words about why this actually works. Why the idea behind the PCI is that we can learn a lot from propaganda content coming out from those authoritarian countries because words matter, right? Propaganda content is basically highly disciplined messages given out by policymakers in those countries. And it reflects the intention of what those policymakers have in mind that they are not explicitly telling us. So a typical inference problem in this case is that we'll look at the propaganda content and then we try to infer the policy intentions that we are not directly observing. Now, I have to point out that this is not a new idea, right? Because it has been around not only in academia for decades, but it's also a very common practice in the intelligence community going all the way back to the Second World War, when, for those of you who know this history stories, it started when the Nazi Germany was invaded the rest of the world. And in the intelligence community, not only in the US, but also in UK, there are a lot of analysts who are monitoring Nazi propaganda and just based on the words coming out from the Nazi German regime to infer their actions. So this is not new. But what is new here is that it has been a very labor-intensive project to monitor propaganda and analyze them. Until most recently, because of the development in the natural language processing techniques, we can do this job much better. So the idea is to bring in NLP techniques to do the left-hand side of this inference problem, right? Because analyzing content in propaganda outlet is just a typical task that NLP can perform. It's just like analyzing any other text. And then after we have done analysis using NLP, we can make those inference problems much easier. So this is what the PCI is about. We try to automate the left-hand side in analyzing propaganda, and then it helps people make easier inferences or to make inferences on the policy implications coming out from those messages. The current lineup in the PCI Index, we have 3 projects that we have completed in the past few years on China. In the first one is called what we call the Policy Chang Index China project, PCI China, which tries to predict on a quarterly basis whether the general direction of policy in China is changing. Right? So meaning at the national level, whether the Chinese government is now pursuing certain different policies than what they have done in the past. The second project is to predict, as I said, to monitor the Hong Kong protests and predict whether they will face military crackdown by the Chinese military. And the third one, what we call the PCI Outbreak, is to estimate the true scale of COVID-19 in China. So we try to look past the numbers and instead look at the words coming out from the Chinese government's mouth to infer how bad it really was back a few months ago. Now, let me go through them one by one and show you what is the capabilities of the PCI project. The first one, we are trying to answer this question of whether the propaganda content put out by the Chinese government has changed its emphasis. The NLP problem is on the left-hand side. So what we do here is basically to build a front page classifier, which the input data to the algorithm is the newspaper articles in China's official newspaper called the People's Daily, which is, by the way, the Chinese version of Pravda. Right? So it's the most prominent newspaper published by the Chinese government. Now, what we do with this algorithm is that we try to use historical data to build a binary classifier, which upon seeing an article is able to predict whether that article appears on the front page or not. And of course, because it's historical data, right, we actually know the correct answer of whether each article appears on the front page. And with that algorithm, we are then to take that to the next step to apply the algorithm to future data. And the way it's useful is because when we see a new article coming in, and if the machine makes a mistake, for example, when the machine sees a new article and considers it as not important and should not go on the front page, but what if it ends up on the front page, right? So that will mean that the content behind the article is something new, something newly important that the machine has never seen before, right? For example, if you train an algorithm using the infamous Cultural Revolution era data in China, where market, for example, market economy was considered evil, right? But with that algorithm, when you see an article that's about economic reforms in China, opening up the economy to the rest of the world, the algorithm will think that's not important. But if that article comes on the front page, it indicates that that's a new agenda the government will be pursuing. So this is all the NLP model does on the left-hand side, is to predict whether the shift in emphasis has happened in the Chinese propaganda. The inference problem we can make on top building on this result would be what the next move by the Chinese government will be, right? Because it has been a standard practice in the Chinese regime to try to change people's opinion before actually changing the policies. And the ideology driving this method is because the Chinese Communist Party always considered, it's for the good of the people. The people are in general not smart enough to see the future of the bright future for the economy. So now we are here to help. So the first step toward helping the general population is to say, oh, this is the right move, so we should do that next, right? So by the time we have detected changes in propaganda, it already indicates the future action by the Chinese government. The result looks like this. It's an index. The PCI China is an index that goes all the way back to 1951 when we first started having the data. It's a quarterly indicator that if it spikes, it indicates that in that particular quarter, the emphasis in the propaganda has significantly changed. And so that naturally, if you look at all these events marked on the picture, it indicates the actual policy. So the standard test for this, for the validity of this method is whether significant policy changes actually did happen after we have seen a spike in the index, which turns out largely to be the case, right? So the most significant one will be the one around 2005 on this picture where you see a huge spike. The spike actually happened in 2004, and that turns out to have predicted the major policy turn in 2005. Now, there's too many events here to go through, but I do want to point out the latest development in the project where we have detected a significant shift in the second quarter of 2020. Now, this is after COVID, right? What it indicates, the spike indicates a turn, a pivot back to the standard policy pursued by the Chinese government, which is a populist agenda, solving the problem of income inequality or regional disparity, all those standard policies that the Xi Jinping administration has been pursuing before COVID. But what is more interesting is that we also detected a significant shift in the in terms of emphasizing military aggression or the emphasis on the military power of the Chinese government. This is very unusual, and what it would indicate is that soon there might be a military conflict between China and some other neighboring countries or regions. Now, we don't know exactly where the conflict might be. It could be Taiwan, for example, which is on the news all the time, or it could be the South China Sea, or maybe the Sino-Indian border. But what it does show, although we don't know specifically where that might happen, is that it's likely that some form of military conflict might be on the horizon sometime soon. So this is how, for example, by detecting a shift in emphasis in the propaganda machine, we can predict the shift in actual action to expect sometime soon. Another project we have done in the past is called PCI Crackdown. The question we try to address is this, going back to the equation, right, the inference problem. On the left-hand side, we are trying to assess how the Hong Kong protests, both last year and this year, have been portrayed in the propaganda in China, and how that compared to the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, which, as you know, has seen a violent military crackdown on the date of June 4th, 1989. Right? So the NLP task here is that we would build a classifier that upon seeing an article published today or any other day, it would predict when the publication happened. So the training data we use in this project is all the articles relevant to the Tiananmen Square protest back in '89. So when the machine sees an article, it will be able to pinpoint whether it's published on June 4th, the day of the crackdown, or June 3rd, or June 2nd, or any other date in the month leading up to the actual crackdown action. The reason timing matters is that it's because in the month leading up to the crackdown in 1989, there was a clear escalation of language in the publications about the protesters in Tiananmen Square. Because when the students first came on the Tiananmen Square, they were called demonstrators. And then they became protesters, and then rioters, and then traitors. So it gets worse and worse. And all that changes in language happened before the actual crackdown happened in June 4th. And so when we have trained the algorithm to predict the date of publication, it already gives us a proxy for the tension in the language. And then we apply the algorithm to articles on current days about the Hong Kong protest. Because the algorithm was trained in '89, right? So upon seeing an article about Hong Kong protests, the machine would also think the articles were coming from '89. So that would be factually wrong, because the Hong Kong protest articles were published either last year or this year, right? But the mistake, again, is very informative, because that's precisely how close it is in timeline to 1989 on June 4th is precisely what we want, right? Because that's the proxy measure for how much tension we are seeing today surrounding the Hong Kong protests. And so that NLP result directly gives us a sense of how likely a crackdown in actual action is going to happen. The result looks like this. This picture shows the index last year, starting from the beginning of the Hong Kong protests in early June. And it goes all the way to early January, when the first wave of protests in Hong Kong has ended. The way to read this chart is that the horizontal line is the actual timeline last year, and the vertical one is a hypothetical timeline, which is what the machine mistakenly thinks each article was published on 1989, right? And if you see the index shoots across this dashed line, the June 4th line, it would indicate that the crackdown is imminent. And so, as you can see, although it did not happen, and the indicator did not predict that it would happen in terms of the actual crackdown, it does shows the ups and downs in language. For example, when you see the first spike here on in the middle of August, I think, when there was a first anti-riot drill near Hong Kong border, the index spiked up to about just 10 days before the action, suggesting that in action, in terms of a crackdown, was quite likely back then. Now, this is the result for last year in the first wave of the protest. And then, of course, it happened again this year, right? Because largely of the national security law that the Chinese government sort of legislated on Hong Kong's behalf. And that drove many people back on the street in pro-democracy protests. Again, the actual crackdown did not happen this year. But what we did see, very interestingly, is that although the national security law was rolled out in May, the index already picked up certain buildup of the propaganda here in early April, which means that the crush on pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong by Beijing was very much deliberate, and it was well thought through, even way before the national security law was announced by Beijing. So this is how, by just looking at how modern day protests in Hong Kong was described in the propaganda, we can sort of get a sense about how likely history might repeat itself in terms of initiating a military crackdown on the pro-democracy protesters. So that's the second project. And we also have a third project, which we call the PCI Outbreak, in which case we are trying to analyze the propaganda surrounding COVID. So the logic here is very similar. We try to learn how SARS back in 2003 was covered by the newspaper, again, by predicting the date of publication. And then we apply that algorithm to COVID-19 and see how that pairs up in terms of the historical coverage. And the reason here, again, time is important is because now 17 years has passed, the SARS outbreak we have gotten a sense of how language has evolved, right, before it hit plateau and after it hit plateau. And so that would give us a sense about how trustworthy those official numbers announced by the Chinese government actually are. And it looks like this. When the red curve shows the official case numbers put out by the Chinese government, and the blue curve is our measured PCI outbreak on a scale of 0 to 1. And the most interesting element here is that although both curves hit plateau around February this year, which sort of is consistent with each other, the most striking thing is that although the pandemic has improved in China, the severity has improved in China, it improves much more slowly than the official number was letting on, which suggests that if there's any intention on the Chinese government's part to conceal the official statistics, it might be worse toward April, May, and June if we compare the word measure versus the official number. Now, I know I'm running a little short on, in time, so let me quickly describe what's next in our lineup of future projects under the PCI umbrella. We are thinking on two directions. One is to go deeper on other important issues on China, including possibly predicting a Sino-Indian border war and also predicting China's Taiwan policies. And the reason these projects might work is because there are historical conflicts between China and India, and also in terms of the Taiwan policy by China, that we could sort of learn the language from the historical coverage in the propaganda. And the other idea we have is to extend this approach to other authoritarian regimes, but not only those regimes in the Eastern Bloc that have already collapsed, but also the modern day North Korea, Iran and Cuba, and basically all these other enemies of freedom, so to speak. And the reason we do this is because we believe the first step toward policy making is to better understand the problem. So we try to build open source technologies to help policymakers and also the general public to understand these problems better. And everyone who's interested is able to check out our project for free. And you can find more information and the source code on the policychangeindex.org. And we are also running a monthly newsletter to keep our users informed in the latest development. And feel free, please, to reach out if you have any questions. And I think I will use the rest of the time to answer some of the questions you may have. Thank you very much.